Welcome back. You're watching Global Today here on Morning Prime. We continue the conversation here. This is the final leg of the program and trying to analyze what is happening currently in Somalia. And holding court still with Samira Guide, who is Executive Director of Haral Institute. Also, we have with us Professor Peter Kagwanja, CEO of Africa Policy Institute, and Dr. Hassan Kaneje, who's the Director of the Horn Institute. So the question we were broaching before you took a short break is the issue of ATMIS right now, and also the prayers of the Somali government that what had been planned as a transition for the Somali government with ATMIS, that particular transition plan should be implemented. Do you think it has been slow in coming, the transition plan itself?
So this, I want to go back first to the ATMIS mission.
Yes, please.
And something that Professor Kagwanja was talking about and how the mission started. Initially, in 2007 when the Al-Shabaab scourge began, there was difficulty in finding forces that would come to Somalia. So at that time, you just had a small force which was Uganda and Burundi that came in to replace Ethiopian forces that had invaded Somalia in support of the government that had been selected in Nairobi. Mm-hmm. So from that humble beginning, the mission expanded to allow neighbors, even though Somalia's request was that neighbors shouldn't be part of the process, shouldn't be part of the troop contributing countries. Unfortunately, because there was no other willing member states that were willing to send forces to Somalia, then Somalia had to make do and accept the presence of Kenyan forces, Ethiopian forces, Djibouti forces. Rehatting, as we've spoken about, rehatting Kenyan forces to ATMIS forces, I think has limited the types of operations that Kenya can conduct in Somalia, the numbers that it has in Somalia. But at the same time, I think as much as we want to say that this is now an AU mission, the realities on the ground is that there is troop contributing countries in specific areas that are completely in control somehow in these autonomous regions and decide what happens there. Mm-hmm. And then, the sensitivities that also Professor Kagwanja was talking about was that Kenya came into Somalia supporting a specific militia force that then took over the port of Kismayo and was then selected as the political leadership of that region. And because that hasn't changed since Kenya moved in, and because of the difficulties between that administration and the federal government, Kenya was seen to be taking sides, as we saw last year. So there's the intricacies that we should always be conscious of when we're talking about this incursion, this Kenyan presence in Somalia as part of ATMIS. Mm-hmm. But when you talk about the mission, this mission, I worked with AMISOM for a number of years before I moved to the federal government. The mission is one of the cheapest missions globally. I think one thing that we don't talk about is how much sacrifice the AU forces are making in Somalia compared to the sacrifices that are made by others. I think it's the bloodiest mission worldwide. It has been recorded as the bloodiest mission in number of body count. But despite that, AU is still begging for support, whether it's force enablers, whether it's sustainable funding. Mm-hmm. Now we're having cuts to the troops. We're now at 18,000. This was at a high of 22,000 maybe 2 years ago. We're at 18,000, and we're talking about drawdown in 3 years' time, where you have, for instance, the mission in South Sudan, mm-hmm. With 17,000 forces, UN forces that are fully paid for with all the assets that they could ask for. AU has not had the benefit, or ATMIS has not had the benefit of these other missions. So will it be able to implement transition as written down? I really doubt it. Mm-hmm. The idea is when they signed this new agreement, the resolution that was passed in April 1st, within 9 months, ATMIS has to reorganize into a more mobile force, into not holding territories but becoming more mobile, sending out forces that are able to respond to the threat right now. They cannot spare forces at the moment with the kind of numbers they have and the positions that they have to hold. Mm-hmm. They cannot spare numbers. That would need the Somali government to generate forces. Somali government, with the arms embargo as it stands, even if it were to generate forces, cannot ably take over positions from ATMIS. Mm-hmm. So it's like a catch-22. You're stuck in a loop. ATMIS is not capacitated enough to be able to take the fight to Al-Shabaab and then hand over to the Somali security forces. The Somali security forces have the challenge of the arms embargo and also the pace of their regeneration. So will we see a case where in 2023 we will have transition? I really doubt it.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think we've exhausted on Somalia, unless you have any other point that you want to raise so far, just briefly, so that we can move to also Ethiopia and this key meeting that will be happening in South Africa. President Uhuru Kenyatta will not be attending. What does it really portend right now? He says this was poor communication that was coming from AU, and that's really conflicted with his diary. He's a key figure who is supposed to be in this meeting in Somalia. So the question is, how will it pan out on Sunday? As I mentioned earlier, President Uhuru, or in a statement that was there from the communications team of President Uhuru Kenyatta, and it says, in a statement, it exposed poor communication among peace talk negotiators. Kenya made reference to a press statement issued on Wednesday that announced his attendance at the peace talks, which seemingly meant they didn't check regarding his availability on that particular note. But what does it really portend for this particular meeting? Should it be hanging in the balance? Was President Uhuru's presence also very pivotal for this particular undertaking?
Before we leave Somalia, because I would like him to take his cue on what you're asking. I just needed to summarize by saying that the one single most important lesson that we have learned as Kenyans about intervening in Somalia is that we need to put a lot of anthropologists on the ground in order to know the culture and the differences and conflicts within the areas we are intervening. Because the moment we do that and we uphold this so-called professionalism of our military, then we fall into very serious problems. Like what I was saying, and now I found where Madobe comes from, is Mohammed Subey. So we have two sub-clans of the Somali, of the Ogaden clan that dominate the Ogaden, the main dominant, the main influential. On the one side are the Marehan, and the other side are Mohammed Subey. These are dominant. And what happened is that the two were conflicting. Ahmed Madobe is Mohammed Subey sub-clan, and Farmajo is Marehan, and therefore their battle settled on these two areas. And the Kenyan forces were caught in between in this particular intra-Somali sub-clan wars. And I think those are the lessons that we should keep in mind in the future, that before we get invested deeply into a situation, we understand how to navigate this. We went for royalty because definitely Ahmed Madobe has been loyal to Somalia and to the compatriots who are the Kenyan forces, and it has remained so since. But for Farmajo, who is from the other clan, he saw this not as a help to Somalia, but undermining him, and he went out of his way to basically make everything volatile, from the border dispute, which was being negotiated or dealt with in different ways, to now our connections, even jeopardizing institutions that we had set together, to kind of mediate between us, the joint commission between Kenya and Somalia, which is the same we have with Ethiopia and other countries, which help us to solve to address some of our issues of mutual interest. So the point is that those small things, like differences within clans and sub-clans in Africa, matter in terms of intervention. They really matter.
All right. Dr. Kanenje?
On Somalia?
No.
I thought you got a cue from Professor Professor Kagwenja on what to do next.
Sometimes when Prof talks, I wonder which specific clan he belongs to.
Myself?
Yourself?
No, I am Mursade.
Mursade?
Yes.
Okay.
Those are not Ogaden, the Hawiye.
The Hawiye?
I've been adopted.
I see.
Yes. It's not one of the biggest. I wish being who I am from Mount Kenya, yes, I should be Habagil. Then naturally, and I do a lot of things with the Habagil because we have the same blood and the same orientation. But for royalties purposes, I'm Mursade.
Okay. Same orientation in what sense?
No, because they are traders. They are big traders.
Oh, okay.
There is no business they cannot do. But there is no business they cannot do, and there is no business they will do badly. They will always break even.
You're the ones who opened up the kiosk with Uliza Fundi wa Stiba Hapa.
Yes. And when you go to Ethiopia, our counterparts, we have our counterparts there, and they have the same behaviors and everything as us. We are not Amhara, we are not Tigray. No, there is another clan. Let me not scandalize it. So fine.
Okay, let me not go there because I wanted just to talk about extraction of ETH.
He's afraid he may be accused of hate speech.
Yes.
So,
Okay.
First of all, the kind of debacle we are seeing with this AU process is unfortunate, but neither is it also surprising. I think Mohamed Faki has gotten it on this process from a very, terrible place. Now, Kenya has been very instrumental, especially in the efforts to try and not just reach a ceasefire, but move towards a negotiated settlement between the warring parties in Ethiopia. In fact, for much of this year, Nairobi has pretty much been the place where efforts towards resolving Ethiopian conflict was being conducted. Now, when we're talking about Uhuru, President Uhuru is not just a person, he's Kenya's envoy to the place. So that's actually Kenya. That means Kenya was not consulted, Kenya was not informed. Dibal, when it comes to such conflicts such as this one, any peace processes normally needs to be number one, or efforts to be communicated with the parties. Remember, initially, even TPLF said they were unaware of certain things. So how would you be planning to hold peace talks between parties when one of them may not even be aware of what you're trying to do? Fundamentally, one of the main person who's been involved in that process before and who has the goodwill and the confidence of both parties is not informed on anything. Many people, including people in this room, whenever you get invited to a place, to an important thing, you ask, what is going to be my role? Okay. Now, if you've been one of the people who've been playing the main role, for instance, and you've not even been informed what role you're going to play, it's unlikely actually going to show up for that, things like that. And so, the lack of structure, lack of modalities, lack of objective, and ensuring that the key players who are supposed to be involved in that process are informed on everything, including people need to know even who is going to show up, so you can prepare yourself. Some of them, sometimes you had interaction with them, sometimes you're going to have some pre-negotiation before negotiation. These things always take place. You agree on certain things even before you actually get in there. The public generally sees the final outcome, what has happened. What they don't understand is actually what needs to be done towards that. And so, as long as, for instance, such mechanisms are not going to be put in place, such frameworks, it's unlikely that even these coming discussions in Pretoria, or rather in South Africa, are going to, to bear any fruits. Because without having those fundamentals, it's going to be a problem. Now, it's a good thing that both parties have agreed, for an AU-mediated process. What is important is both parties need to understand, to agree to the persons who are going to actually undertake that. So, for instance, if you get there and people realize that perhaps even the AU, Olusegun Obasanjo perhaps is not acceptable, and perhaps Ramaphosa may not be acceptable, then of course those discussions are going nowhere. And that's why I think it's critically important that the AU goes back to the drawing board and ensures that, okay, going forward, how best can we be able to do this? Neither can you be able to actually do this without, for instance, involvement of certain other parties, including countries in the region. And Kenya, that has been playing an instrumental role in that process, it needs to be on the table. So while it may be embarrassing that such information such as this one is coming out in the public, because then it makes Africa look really disorganized, when it comes to these processes, I think it's important for AU to look at itself. Do not rush to get the results and get the wrong results. I think it's important to plan sufficiently so that you can ensure success. The conflict in Ethiopia is way too important. Ethiopia is one of the anchor states in this region, one of the most populous countries on the continent, and a very significant country in the region. And its continued intractability of that conflict is not just affecting Ethiopia, it's affecting the entire region. And so to the extent that AU is unable to put together a sound process, organized, well-structured, it's honestly embarrassing. And I'm hoping going forward that lessons are going to be learned from this, and that we stop this kind of haphazardness, especially in peace processes, in terms of we approach it, because this has contributed previously to some of the failed attempts to resolve conflicts, not just in Ethiopia, but in so many actually other conflicts around the continent. And I think we really need to be professional in the way we go about this. And if they need help, there are a lot of people who have experience in doing this and they can offer. I'm sure Professor Peter Kagwaja here, can also be open.
Yes, I was waiting to be appointed. I wasn't.
Yes, you
So for 1,000 applicants as well, they paid down to how many?
How many? For what? For this position?
Yes.
The mediator? No,
the mediator.
This was given straight to the former president.
Okay. I just wanted to reiterate what the president said. He's saying, this is President Uhuru Kenyatta, that in the interim, and as you consider the possibility for another date, I will be grateful to receive further clarity on the structure and modalities of the talks, including, but not limited to, the rules of engagement for all the interlocutors invited.
Let's be clear about this, that the conflict in Ethiopia between the Tigray PLF and the government in Mogadishu, in Addis Ababa, was not just the military. I think it was more vicious at the diplomatic front. And each side tried to rope in every side. And if you look at Uganda's position, South Sudan's position, and so on. Now, Kenya itself found itself in a very difficult situation, because as the conflict was, brewing up, we were already at the United Nations Security Council, and therefore we held a very heavy club that could have misused in Ethiopia.
Okay.
But we decided to be magisterial, which I think was very wise on President Uhuru Kenyatta's choices of how to deal with this issue. There was a lot of pressure from the West to rein in Addis Ababa and go very hard on Abiy and the team there. But Kenya decided not to do that. We are the ones who tried to open this avenue for mediation. And the word mediation was never in anybody's lips. It was basically victory. And therefore you establish a victor's justice in that country. And that's why the war itself initially was defined as, law enforcement rather than, a conflict. Now it is accepted as a conflict, and Kenya is the indispensable mediator, not by virtue of who we are in the region, but by virtue of how we have carried ourselves in this case, and endeared the trust of both the TPLF and the government, without any one of them feeling that we are going to favor anyone. And when President William Ruto appointed Uhuru Kenyatta to mediate within the region, the mandate was more regional. I zeroed in on Ethiopia, because there is nobody else who can deal with this question better than this. But we have a problem here, and the problem is the African Union. For the first time, the African Union is out of order and out of protocol, and it should be told so in no uncertain terms. It has completely taken side with the government in Addis Ababa from the word go. From the word go. And therefore, it should be the last organization to have anything called mediation in Ethiopia. It should actually stop anything.
But that really beats the purpose.
No. They have a role. The Peace and Security Council of the African Union has a role to draw the structure. And that's what President Kenyatta is asking. The way they did for Kenya, they didn't come to mediate our conflict here. They drew the framework, the structure, the terms of engagement, who is in, who is out. But now there is this tussle with its own peace people, Obasanjo, who said Obasanjo is the one to mediate this issue. You put Uhuru Kenyatta here and Obasanjo here, what are you going to get out of there? Have you studied the chemistry between those and ensured that Uhuru Kenyatta is going to a meeting that is shared by Obasanjo? I mean, are you elevating him or demeaning him? I mean, so there are other issues that may not find their way into your paper and the complaint, but peace negotiations are sensitive processes. They are processes that require you to study the minutest without disregard of anything. Like we have said, our problem with Somalia is not that we are not doing anything good. It is not understanding their sub-clan arithmetics. Not even clan. Their sub-clan arithmetics get us in a lot of hot soup. So the point is, the African Union should pull back now and confine itself to what it's supposed to do, get its Peace and Security Council together, draft up the terms and the framework of engagement in negotiation, and then allow Kenya, via Uhuru Kenyatta, to mediate this particular process, because we have established ourselves as the people who can be trusted.
Under what framework will Uhuru Kenyatta then operate?
But that's what we're saying, that when they draw the framework, it's the AU framework, but defined by the Peace and Security Council, which is a group of all the African countries that have been elected in that council. And Kenya happened to be part of that. And therefore, by drawing that framework, they have now exited, because anybody can implement it. Anybody can implement it. Now, remember, when they put us in this kind of situation where President Kenyatta says, I am not able to do this, they are now bringing other problems into us as a country, which basically means that President Kenyatta is becoming insubordinate to President William Ruto, because William Ruto mentioned it in public, which is not the case. The case here is that both William Ruto and Uhuru Kenyatta are respected by the Ethiopians.
Right, so you're talking about Ruto appointing President Uhuru Kenyatta as a special envoy.
As a special envoy
to the Horn of Africa.
To the Horn of Africa.
Yes.
And the Kenyatta is invited, and in the first invite, he seems not to be wanting to go, which is not the case.
Indeed.
The case is that it is not about Kenyatta, it's not about Ruto, it's about an African Union misbehaving.
All right. Okay, Samira, if I come to you, because I think, yes, African Union has not been putting its duck in a row as it is, because it's not only Uhuru Kenyatta who has raised hesitation with this arrangement. We have also TPLF leader Gabriel Michael saying that, or he said, an auspicious start to the talks must be preceded with clarification on whether there will be additional actors invited as participants, observers, or guarantors. And I think even that was not made very limpid and clear for the TPLF leader as well.
I think so. I think, like Professor just said, mediation really is very complex, and each of the actors really matter. Who is at the table, who's guaranteeing the process is very important. The AU has a huge challenge. I think the challenge lies in the fact that it's hosted by Ethiopia. I think when a country has been the anchor state, has been the host of the regional organization, the regional organization finds itself in a very difficult position, trying to again mediate on behalf of that country or in support of other actors within that country. So there's been question of bias, there's been question of whether the AU is the right institution to be the ones anchoring this peace talks. And the TPLF, of course, have raised that concern. Like Professor said, it doesn't necessarily have to be an AU-led process. It can be, a number of actors can come together. It could have been an IGAD-led process. It could be a UN-mandated process. There's various ways of going about it, but I have a fear that right now, as it stands, any AU-led process might not achieve much because of the doubts about their impartiality around the process. And then granted, with this one, I think the talks were postponed in South Africa. Not only did President Uhuru Kenyatta decline, I think a number of other participants also indicated that they were not informed or consulted in the process. And so whenever you see this, ragged start to a process, then it creates doubt on whether that process can eventually achieve success. So I really think we need to go back to the table as Africa. We need to go back to the table in support of Ethiopia as it stands.
Right, indeed. Thank you. Have we exhausted on that? If there's any other issue, then so it has been postponed.
Yeah, the
It
talks
has
are
been
not under
yeah. So until now, they put their ducks in a row as it is. Good.
And putting their ducks in a row means basically African Union exiting, mediating the process, and limiting itself to its own mandate, defined clearly by the protocol establishing the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, which is the collective body of the African. It's our equivalent of the United Nations Security Council. If that council decides that this is the way the framework is being done, then we will have a good beginning. Obasanjo has no business in this because he's part of the Council of the Wise and the panel of eminent persons. Maybe the Ethiopians would, TPLF might prefer Mbeki or Chisano or somebody else. But the fact that he's sitting for the Horn of Africa does not mean that automatically this is a bureaucratic process where he inherits that and then start mediating in Ethiopia. Peace process is a very sensitive process, and they might throw us into very serious affairs. I respect a lot of President Obasanjo. I've attended a lot of meetings with him in Lake Tana in Ethiopia, and he's a great leader, leader. But in this particular case, I think the AU need to pull back and just limit itself to its technical part of this. That doesn't mean it will not participate in the process, but the framework must be guided by a more neutral body like the Peace and Security Council of the Union, not the Council of Eminent Persons and pressures from the West.
Thank you.
Who they can do better.
Right, thank you. So in the meantime, also, you should be aware that in South Sudan, at least 25 people have been killed in a communal land violence. And it says here that after youths from, this is what officials said, after youths from two neighboring communities in the country's north clashed over a disputed borderline separating their areas, violence is endemic in parts of South Sudan, where clashes triggered by localized disputes over grazing areas, water, cultivation grounds, and other resources often turn deadly. The country's volatile politics often helps exacerbate some of the localized disputes fanning the violence. And in the last unrest, armed youths from the Twik community in Warrap State on the border with South Sudan on Monday attacked residents of neighboring Abyei town, also on the border. And an additional 12 people were killed among the Abyei residents, including 2 women and a child. This is according to a local administration official, Deng Ajak. Both sides disagree over whether the borderline separating the two communities lie, with each claiming the other is encroaching on their land. Both officials alluded to this. Now, the episode in the latest deadly clash between the two communities over the same land. In February, armed youth from Twik launched attack on Abyei residents, and several people were killed, other displaced, and houses burnt. And just what we are talking about, the specter of climate change also is exacerbating this. It will be a war of resources, war of water. That will be very key. Now, I want just to draw your attention on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, and just following what is happening in Ukraine and Russia. Russia unleashes mass strikes. Moscow hits civilian infrastructure in Kyiv, other cities in response to attack on bridge. You know what really happened there. And you can see people were running. It says here waves of Russian missiles slammed into Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities in one of the broadest and most intense barrages of the war. In response to a weekend attack, Moscow blamed on Ukraine that seriously damaged a bridge connecting Russia to occupied Crimea. And well, it's just to highlight what is happening right now in Russia. There has been talks of annexation in Moscow. He gave one of the fiercest speeches that we've ever heard. We know Vladimir Putin really right now fulminating with anger. Could we really talk about this, and what does it really portend, even with the nuclear threat that now is looming from Russia? Hanenje?
Yes. It's been a while since we spoke about this issue in this program.
I know.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean the war stopped. Indeed, I think many of our colleagues in the West may not want to look at it this way, but I think NATO and Moscow, they are dragging us to the brink of a nuclear catastrophe. And I'm saying this because there is no incentive on either party, meaning the main party, whether in Moscow or Kyiv, to actually either pull back or stop the conflict. On one side, Kyiv has been registering a number of battlefield success, in part because of almost unlimited supply of arms and air defense systems and drones, coming from NATO member states. And Moscow is unwilling to be able to say, to give up on that, because that's going to be seen as a humiliation, in part. But then it also looks as it is an existential, kind of thing. So capitulating to this pressure right now may send an extremely wrong message to its citizens, and may ensure perhaps, permanent, NATO presence on its, doorstep, which I think, according to those who are going to make policy and defense analysts, will be unacceptable to not just to Putin, but probably to any leader. It was going to be in Moscow. Generally, big powers want to have defensible borders, but even rising powers and many countries would like to have defensible borders. And if that is not guaranteed, it's going to be a challenge. Now, one thing we are facing, though, as the Global South, is we're being caught, in crossfire. And initially, I think there were attempts by both parties to try and recruit allies, and they're still continuing. Some of them made mistakes by, I think, giving ultimatums to countries on the continent as well as in the rest of the world, which, of course, then did not work very well, because that is not exactly a conflict for Africa or a conflict with the Global South. That does not mean that Africa is not suffering as a result. And the kind of challenge we're facing, especially in the wake of drought and famine, of rising commodity prices, is not going to go down very quickly, in part because by all estimates, this conflict is going to continue for a while, and it may actually get worse. If it does, just forget about the prospect of low energy prices. It's not going to happen. That means we're going to have to find a different way of actually dealing with it, including perhaps re-establish partnerships with sometimes countries that some of our partners will not want to be happy with regard to being able to have access to cheaper fuel. Let's face it, every country and every region and they need to look out for themselves too.
Yes.
So we need to look out for ourselves as a region in East Africa and in Kenya. We may need to find alternatives, for instance, for fertilizer and stuff like that. We cannot wait for the war to end because we do not know when it's going to end. But to the extent that that many of the big powers are now literally blind and deaf to the calls, especially from the Global South, to stop this war, is telling. It's telling in the sense that I do not think the continent should ever be able to trust, or at least give away its future when it comes to planning, whether in terms of food security or anything else, hoping that the rest of the world is going to behave responsibly, because we have seen countries that are supposed to be behaving responsibly are not behaving responsibly. Neither was the continent consulted when this war began. And the continent was not consulted, of course, when sanctions are imposed all across, of course, which again affect the continent. And so I think, speaking as an East African, it's about time we actually started charting out an independent direction on food security, on things such as fertilizers, and on fuel. There are countries in the Gulf right now which some of them are very happy because they're reaping great from the increased oil prices. I think Moscow reached a deal the other day with Saudi to not to increase production. That also means there's going to be less fuel available. Those who are producing oil are going to benefit more.
Yes.
So where does that leave us as the continent? That means if we have to start striking deals with some oil-producing countries to actually give us food, cheaper oil is going to be important. And we have to speak with one voice, because some of these kind of arrangements are going to violate, at least in theory, sanctions imposed, for instance, by the West to certain other countries. Now, what do you do in those circumstances? Second, there are countries like Kenya, for instance. We have some arrangement with some oil-producing countries, sometimes that we have not followed through. And even as a region, what direction should we go? And perhaps finally, the event that took place when President William Ruto was visiting Tanzania with regard to agreement of the pipeline, that thing I think should be fast-tracked so that we can start getting gas at least to lessen some of the pain that is going to be experienced not just by Kenyans but many in East Africa. We are at a critical point generally in world history. The post-Ukrainian conflict world order is going to be fundamentally different, and the world will never go back to the to where it was before. We are essentially right now a multipolar world, and multipolarity, a lot of times it creates a lot of chaos. It creates a lot of instability. How are we prepared to deal with this coming instability, this coming chaos and uncertainty? Because if we don't define ourselves properly, we're going to be defined by others, and we're going to lose.
I find I've always found myself on the controversial side of this debate on Russia, Ukraine, because I don't think it's a Russia-Ukraine conflict. This is a conflict between the Warsaw Pact and the NATO. Now the Warsaw Pact wound back into Russia now, Moscow, and the NATO expanding, so that whereas Warsaw Pact kind of retracted, the other one is expanding, and Putin, as a product of the old order, is very unhappy with this. It's good to characterize Putin as a product of old order, because if you remember the story of him as an officer in Germany at the time that Boris Yeltsin and others were doing whatever they were doing, his pain and everything can be seen in this war. I think Putin has no qualms annexing parts of Ukraine, as he has already done with the Crimea. The parts that he strongly feel are Russian, particularly where the Russian speakers are, because they think that he has a moral responsibility to protect Russian speaking within the Ukraine part. Therefore, we are likely to see more annexation. Part of the reason why, I asked he was there, we asked the Russian officials why they are not going hard on Ukraine, and why they look like they are not fighting but toying around with this war, given their military capacity. He said, these are our people. We cannot go bombing houses and bombing people out of the time. We have to just target the enemy. But now it has reached a level, I think, where NATO has become open. It's not hiding anymore. It is giving the most sophisticated of the arms to the Ukrainian. And the idea is to humiliate Russia. And Russia will not take the humiliation, I imagine. And therefore, we are now beginning to see kind of an element of what we call the total war. And total war is not the best of the things, because it has too much collateral damage. And this is what we're beginning to see. Now, turning to the responses by the West, the response is that you don't want to be held. America has been putting Europe under pressure not to allow itself to succumb or capitulate to the Russian strategies of sustaining itself in the war, including continuing to consume its gas and oil, and therefore indirectly funding the war in Ukraine. This is the argument we make in other areas in counterterrorism, that you're funding the war. Now, what are they doing? And Debal, you are the one who mentioned this in the morning. We didn't get into it. That we are now rolling back all the gains we have made in combating climate change. We are getting to the crude world, and do we have any moral authority anymore to tell China to roll back on its industries that produce, carbon and so on? No, we don't. In fact, China now must have an open check to do what it does, because if Europe is doing the same, going back to the old obsolete technology that used to heat their houses, so they can heat their houses, and therefore going back, on the climate change, then we have a problem here. And therefore, they can also not tell Africa not to continue exploring for oil and gas within our neighborhoods. And that leads me to the last and the final point that I want to make here about the impact on Africa and chances that we have. I am more optimistic and I blame Africa. Because this is our chance. When the rest are in chaos, we should put our house in order. This is the time for Kenya, Tanzania, Somalia, and other African countries to now begin exploiting their gas and oil resources. Yeah, and we have them. They have been explored. We know where they are. Why don't we begin exploring and then taking them to market and becoming part of the OPEC and other organizations that are now selling oil, petroleum and oil in that regard. Now, so we need to be looking for partners urgently to get this on course. In the Kenyan coast, what have we found? We stop our wars with the Somalia about this maritime border and form a common authority and start exploring oil in our common territories. Or wherever we think we have a problem, we have common authorities and go to those areas and explore for gas. Not explore, but start exploiting the gas. I agree with Dr. Hanenji about commodities like fertilizers. We have Morocco, which has huge resources, part of the hugest in the world of fertilizers. We have our own issues with Morocco on the question of, Western Sahara and so on. But just strategically speaking, at this hour and time, we have to be more, to lean more on realpolitik than, idealism. And real politics requires that we look for this. Let me make the final point, not the final point, but the sub-point, which is basically that Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda are the best land for growing sunflower and, of course, corn. Why are we talking about shortage of oil? We should be using this opportunity not only to supply ourselves with that, but to grow sunflower and others and produce oil to supply the world. The market is now ripe.
On the flip side, we're importing a lot of palm oil.
We shouldn't be doing that. We are doing that. We are exchanging. I like the idea of us having a direct trade with Ghana with the palm oil and us giving them our coffee. I like that enough. And again, this is another opportunity for Africa to deepen intercontinental trade rather than outside. Yes.
Thank you. Samira, finally on this.
I think on the Ukraine issue, I think the war has escalated over the past 2 weeks. You've had, I think Ukraine was talking about over 75 missiles, cruise missiles targeting civilian sites, but Russia was categorical. It was only targeting, energy, military, and communication infrastructure. This escalation, I think, has been viewed as Russia responding to, the battlefield losses and trying to, amp up its successes on the ground. I don't see a way out of the conflict. We've had about talks, communication between, over the media, communication between Russia and the US, Lavrov saying that the US has not called for genuine talks for them to get out of this crisis. In the short term, we see that this will continue, but in the long run, I think Africa and countries in the global south stand to suffer the most. Just as I've mentioned, in Somalia, we're already seeing the impact of the Ukraine-Russia war in terms of prices, in terms of commodities, wheat. We are receiving a lot of donations, but not as fast as they should be happening. Of course, the response to the famine, expected famine, has also been delayed by focus on the Ukraine and Russia war. I think there's been, I don't know if you've heard of the debate about how the West has responded to Ukraine compared to how it's responding to conflicts in the continent, and where we stand as Africa in responding to our own conflicts and taking these African solutions more seriously now that we see the double standards when the proximity of conflict is on the European continent.
Right, thank you. What will be now your closing headline remarks? Maybe 30 seconds. Samira?
I'll cede to Professor.
Okay, Professor, your closing remarks.
Just to say this is a very useful debate in terms of even for us, I guess that's why we don't miss. It's becoming a platform that we can all rely on in terms of getting information. We'll do our best to update the information and ensure that we give just the best, so that some of the statements we are making about the coming talks in South Africa, where they have already been postponed and so on. So that's some of the things we need to do. I thought a focus on this forum in terms of improving its quality. The reason being, President Museveni told us he watches this. We know for a fact that President Salva Kiir and the establishment in Juba watch this. I do know for a fact that Addis Ababa watches this. So it's incumbent upon us as both the participants and yourself and your team to really up the game and ensure that this becomes what the rest of Africa watches, in order to see genuine African views. Remember, these are African scholars and African professionals who come here, and therefore our view is our view, talking about African solutions to African problems. This is it.
Thank you. Right, Dr. Kanenje, your closing remarks.
My closing remarks, I think, goes to our new young governor of Nairobi. There are a number of things, for good or for bad, that the outgoing administration, especially the Nairobi Metropolitan Services, was able to do fairly well. And I understand that the governor decided to retain some team members with, in terms of infrastructure and stuff like that. I would just like to encourage him to undertake, or at least copy, some of the ethic that was being undertaken by NMS. It has done a lot more in 2 years than actually what has been done in 30 years in many places. And the governor, please also stop cutting down our trees. It takes a very long time to grow trees. Yeah. Many trees in Nairobi, they are much older than you, probably twice as old as our new governor. And so we have to be very important. Let's consult widely, but let's try to maintain the ethics. And if there are functions that perhaps some people in NMS can continue doing that can save you the trouble of dealing with the county assembly, please just do that, because we know there's a lot of politicking that creates a lot of inefficiency within the system. So all the best, and we look forward to seeing you in 2027. So if you've done well, we're going to elect you.
All right, the campaigns have begun very early. But truly, a part of me also dies when I hear the sound of that chainsaw cutting any tree. I think in this moment and in this epoch of time, where we're really suffering as a globe, as a universe, because of climate change, we'd be very cognizant of us to think twice before you fell any tree for whatever reason, right? So thank you very much for your valid company. And you should also grab a copy of the foreign policy, which is truly talking about what we are discussing here. And there, they have very beautiful graphics. If my director will just pick up this as we're winding up. This is the latest copy of the foreign policy. And it's saying we can feed the world. We can feed the world. It's not all doom and gloom as it is right now. It is just apportioning these resources, some of the things that we're talking about, culture. And they're saying why Africa needs more, not less fertilizer, and how to drive down the price of plant-based proteins. Also, plus mushrooms, farming, millets, big gear, and the future of sustainable agriculture. They're talking about India, the way they're reverting now to millet. People are navel-gazing still on maize flour. We should go back to millet and eat a lot of millet as well. So alternative foods as well in light of fighting climate change. We wind up with also the week, and in there, I just want to read the comment that is here. And this is from Paul Miller. He says, the world faces its most dangerous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And this is what Paul Miller was saying in the dispatch. With a deepening crisis on the battlefield, Putin has no path to victory. But to back down will be to acknowledge defeat by Ukraine and, by extension, the US. A pill he can never swallow. So while breaking the nuclear taboo appears irrational to us, it may look different to him. For the imperiled Russian strongman, this war is existential. He wins or he dies. Thank you very much for your valid company. You've been watching Global Today. Don't go away, much more coming up on the other side of the break on News Diary. Have a good day.